The influence of genetics on individual traits, personalities, and life outcomes has been studied in detail for several decades now. The findings are striking. In a given population, most traits are highly heritable through DNA, and about 50% of the difference between individuals on countless physical, psychological, and sociological traits is due to DNA differences. While the blank slate, the idea that human personalities are purely a product of the environment, remain highly influential in the social sciences and the humanities. It is now more than ever a scientific zombie that stays alive despite having been killed repeatedly by the evidence. My guest for this episode, Robert Plomin, is a leading researcher in the field of behavioral genetics. He explains these various findings and the methods used to establish them. Hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here with Professor Robert Plomin. Welcome to the podcast, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Very happy to have you on. So you are now Professor of Behavioral Genetics at King's College in London. You received your doctoral degree in 1974 from the University of Texas at Austin, and the title of your thesis was A Temperament Theory of Personality Development, Parent-Child Interactions. And since then, you published many hundreds of articles in scientific journals and also several books, including Behavioral Genetics, which has had several editions. The last one came out in 2016. There was also G is for Genes, published in 2013. And most recently, now there has been Blueprint, which was published in 2018 and which will be the basis for our discussion. So very broadly, your research deals, among others, with how our genes influence our personality, our behavior, our life outcomes. Maybe before, exploring the results of behavioral genetics, we can start by discussing the methods employed in this field of research to, give the audience a sense of how researchers disentangle the role of genes from that of the environment in shaping individual traits.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to start. Maybe back a little bit conceptually as to what we're trying to do. We're actually trying to understand the causes, the genetic and environmental causes, the nature and nurture of individual differences. Why do people differ so much in personality, psychopathology, cognitive abilities? That's very different from what people often think about. They think of themselves. So if you take weight, body weight, for example, we know it runs in families. Siblings are similar, parents and offspring are similar. It's always been assumed that that's due to nurture, environment. But what we have are techniques like twin studies and adoption studies that disentangle the genetic and environmental sources of individual differences in body weight. And so with body weight, it's perhaps easiest to start with the adoption method, where we study normally when parents and offspring or siblings are reared together, they share nature and nurture. For decades in psychology and in biological sciences too, it was assumed that that resemblance is due to nurture, environment, which makes sense in terms of body weight, for example. Your parents as a child, your parents give you the food and they model lifestyles of activity and all of that sort of thing. So it's reasonable to think it's nurture. But adoption studies show that that resemblance is entirely due to genetics and nature. And the way it does that is if you have parents and offspring living together, they share nature and nurture. So how can you separate that? And the way it's separated is through a social experiment in a way, where you have children who are adopted away at birth from their genetic parents. If it's genetic, the children ought to resemble their birth parents. If it's environmental, they ought to resemble the parents who adopt them, their adopted parents, because they give them the nurture, but not the nature. And what those adoption studies show is that in parents and offspring who share genes and environment, the correlation is about 0.3. I assume your listeners know what a correlation is. It goes from 0 to 1. So 0.3 correlation between parents and offspring. Is it nature or nurture? If it's nurture, you'd expect the correlation of 0.3 between adoptive parents and their adopted children. That correlation is 0. There's no resemblance between the weight of adoptive parents and their adopted children. Well, then, is it really genetic? And the answer is yes. The correlation between adopted children and their birth parent, who they never saw after the first week of life, is 0.3. So those kids' weight correlate just as much with their genetic parents as children and parents are correlated when they share nature and nurture. So that's the adoption design. That's like a social experiment. The other major design is called the twin study, which is like a biological quasi-experiment. It's not an experiment because we don't randomly assign kids to be identical or non-identical twins. But the main thing is about 1% of all births are twins, and 1/3 of those are what we call identical twins, or in the scientific literature, monozygotic. They come from a single zygote, which is a fertilized egg. And in the first few days of life, that egg can divide into two. And those two zygotes are clones of one another. If you sequence their DNA, they have the same DNA. So if genetics is important, you'd expect them to be quite similar because they're genetically identical. The other type of twin, 2/3 of twins, are what we call dizygotic, two zygotes, where they're separately fertilized eggs so that, by different sperm. So they're like any brother and sister who are 50% similar genetically, but they're a good control because they're born in the same womb, they're exactly the same age, they're in the same family. So the essence of the twin method is to say if genetics is important, you'd have to predict that identical twins are more similar than non-identical twins, or monozygotic twins are more similar than dizygotic twins. And that's what you find. For weight, identical twins correlate about 0.6, and dizygotic twins correlate about 0.3. So the difference between that is ascribed to genetics. It gets maybe a little too technical to estimate the effect size, but that difference is half of the genetic difference because fraternal twins, dizygotic twins, are 50% similar genetically. So it's 100 versus 50. That difference is half of the genetic influence. So if you double that difference, you get an estimate of what we call heritability of 60%. So this twin method and adoption method has been used in thousands of studies. There was a meta-analysis over the last century using these methods, and they all point to very substantial genetic influence. But again, I'd like to emphasize that what we're talking about here is what makes people different. So we're not talking about species universals. Why are we as a species as big as we are, for example? Why aren't we as small as squirrels or something like that? We're not talking about evolutionary species-wide issues, nor are we talking about average differences between groups. Men are much taller and heavier than women. Sex accounts for about 40% of the differences between people. So there's a big difference between the sexes. But we're not talking about the cause of that difference. The cause of the average difference between males and females could be different from the causes of individual differences within men and women. The big mistake people make in thinking about what we call heritability, that is the extent to which genetics is important, is they think first it applies to one individual. That's a mistake. We're talking about individual differences in a population. We're saying of the people you see these differences in weight that are obvious. How much of those differences are due to inherited DNA differences? So that's the main thing we're trying to do. It's limited to a particular population at a particular time, as all studies are. So we're not saying that we're saying the heritability of weight's about 60%. We're not saying that that's some constant like the speed of light. In a different population, like in a culture where people are starving, it might be very different. In a different age, like 2 centuries ago, it could be very different. So there's so many misconceptions about this 6-syllable word, heritability, that I do like to make sure at the start we're on the same page. But people sort of know what you're talking about. When you say, is eye color heritable? They sort of know what you mean. I mean, people that differ in eye color, and if you have blue eyes, is that because you have relatives who have blue eyes? And we've also done studies where we asked them to estimate the heritability of things like weight, but also personality and psychopathology and cognitive abilities. And people do now accept genetic influence. 30 years ago, they didn't. Psychology was really dominated by environmentalism, this blank slate notion of nurture being all important. But now most people accept that genetics is important. They generally underestimate it by 50%. And they get some things very wrong, like breast cancer. They think it's almost entirely heritable, but it's one of the least heritable things around. The reason we think it's heritable is because you hear about those breast cancer genes, 3 genes, but actually they're very rare. they don't account for much of the breast cancer. So identical twins, if you're a woman who had an identical twin and your identical twin got breast cancer, your risk isn't 100%, it isn't 50%, it's more like 10%, which is pretty close to the base rate in the population. And the reason for that is that the genes we know about are very rare and they don't account for many cases of breast cancer. So the basic point here is you can't assume what's heritable or not. You have to assess it. Our assumptions about what's heritable don't work. But empirically, the amazing thing from these twin and adoption studies over the century is that everything shows significant genetic influence.
So also regarding the methods, we can talk about the, more specifically or more explicitly gene-focused methods. And if you could explain how people started looking for candidate genes and that didn't work, and then they turned to scanning large parts of the genetic code and seeing these small effects from many different genes that sort of aggregate.
Mm-hmm. Well, for 30 years of my career, I did twin and adoption studies because that's all there was. But in about 1990, I thought, we've learned an awful lot from those approaches. The next step clearly has to be to find some of these inherited DNA differences, to actually measure the DNA itself. And so for 15 years, I tried to do that, but the technology wasn't there at the time. All we could do, you mentioned candidate genes, all we could do is look at a few genes because it was very expensive to genotype them in large samples of people. But then about 2005 or so, a new technology came along. And the advances here were all due to new technology. And it was called a SNP chip. It's a chip the size of a postage stamp that allows you to genotype millions of DNA differences. A SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism. So these are single base pair DNA differences, which is the majority of the DNA differences in our species. So it allowed you to do it quickly and cheaply and across the genome. So you don't just look at one or two genes, you look at all 23 pairs of chromosomes and millions of DNA differences. So that changed everything, and it allowed us to take an atheoretical approach. Instead of saying, well, I think this gene is a candidate for this trait, like with obesity, you could say some aspect of metabolism is important. That didn't pan out. And the reason it didn't pan out is now that we've done these studies with SNP chips in what we call genome-wide association studies, we know that the biggest effects are extremely small. One of the early effects that was found was for obesity, and it was a particular gene called FTO, and it was a particular SNP. And when that was found and published in Science in 2007, people said, well, it only accounts for 1% of the differences between people in body weight. They said, well, it's such a small effect, who cares? Turns out that's one of the biggest effects that are found. And the reason we found it is because it was a relatively big effect, incredibly small for the time. But now what we know is the average effect of a gene isn't 100% or 10% or 1%. It's like 0.01%. So we're talking about thousands of DNA differences of very small effect. Now that's a drag if you're a molecular biologist and want to go from genes to brain to behavior. But it's what nature is telling us. And so for people like me, I want to use DNA differences to predict behavior. I want to know at birth which children are likely to become schizophrenic or have reading difficulties, because all of medicine is moving away from a model where you wait until something happens, like a heart attack, and then you try to fix it. Medicine is moving towards a preventative model. To prevent, you have to predict, and DNA is by far the best predictor. So I'm concerned about prediction, and I don't care if there's 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 DNA differences that help us predict. I just want to predict because then we can study the developmental course and we can begin to intervene to prevent problems, which is so much more cost effective in terms of economics and society, but also personal suffering. This is why in the UK, I don't think it's happening in Germany or France, but several other countries, they're beginning to do nationwide screening, not just for the few genes that have been studied for decades, like phenylketonuria. Every country in the world screens for that at birth. So that's a single gene disorder that if you have a double dose of that mutation, you will have phenylketonuria, which causes severe mental retardation and usually involving institutionalization. You can't take care of yourself. But by screening for it, and it's a single gene, we know how it works. It causes a problem in metabolizing a particular protein called phenylalanine. And if you get that in your diet, and if you can't metabolize it, it builds up in the brain. And somehow, we still don't know how after 50 years, it damages the brain and causes mental disability. But instead of just screening for a handful of single genes, many countries are beginning to screen using these chips, these SNP chips, or to sequence the whole genome of 3 billion base pairs, because it doesn't cost much more to do that than to screen for the handful of genes that we now screen for. And it just seems to me a no-brainer. I know it upsets people, but if you think about cardiovascular disease, we can now predict, not perfectly by any means, because it's only about 50% heritable cardiovascular disease. But we can predict about half of that genetic propensity with DNA alone. And the thing about DNA is it doesn't change during life. From the moment of conception, you've got the same DNA in one cell where you began life, and then that same DNA is in the trillions of cells in your body. So that at birth, if we get this genetic score, which we call a polygenic score for cardiovascular disease, if you're in the top 10% of that, we can predict that you'll be at a 3-fold greater risk for having a severe heart attack. And there are ways that you can prevent it. And usually preventative measures are expensive. We can give everybody the advice to eat well, exercise, that sort of thing. But, we all hear that advice and we don't do much with it. But if I told you that you were at a 3-fold greater risk of having a heart attack, you might pay attention to it. And then furthermore, we could afford for these people at extreme risk to do more expensive things. Like there are these body scan approaches that will allow you to predict early on that a problem's coming, rather than waiting until you have a heart attack, which just from an economic point of view, it's said in the, I can't document this, but it's generally said a severe heart attack will cost about €1 million all told. When you think of all the surgery, the rehabilitation, and then that's not to mention the reduction in quality of life as well.
Right.
It just seems to me such a no-brainer to say, we've got this tool now. Why don't we use it? And people say, yeah, but it's going to cause all these problems, fatalism. People are going to say, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. It's genetic. I don't accept that, but I think we need to have that discussion because it's going to happen, whether we like it or not.
Fair enough. So yeah, we've discussed, how, or at least the fact that genes influence personal traits, life outcomes, and it's also noteworthy that behavioral genetics, sheds light on environmental influences. You write in your book that, so here I will quote, "Genetic research has told us as much about the environment as it has about genetics. At the most basic level, genetics provides the best evidence we have for the importance of the environment independent of genetics." End of the quote. Yeah, so I mean, of course, as you've mentioned, social and psychological scientists have tended to emphasize and overemphasize in many cases the importance of the environment. And behavioral genetics has contributed to better understand the influence of the environment. And one big distinction, which maybe is important to make from the outset, is the difference between the shared and the non-shared environment, if you would like to explain this.
Yes. Well, thanks for mentioning that, because I really do believe it. It isn't just something I say, that genetics has been as important in understanding the environment as it has genetics. And at the most basic level, if you assume, as psychologists and many social scientists assume for decades, that everything's due to nurture. Like when I was in graduate school in the 70s, the textbooks actually said schizophrenia is caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. It was generally kind of mother blaming. Yeah. And, it's so wicked because it's wrong. But imagine you don't find out your kid is schizophrenic till they're maybe 20 years old. And then you're told it's because of what you did early in life. And there's nothing you can do about it now. And the thing is, it's totally wrong. Nurture has no impact on that. It's a matter of genetics. So it's really important for parents to know that. That's one of the things I hope we can get into. I think the single most important thing for parents to know is that genetics is very important. And they have much less control over their kids' development than they think they have. So it's a good message. It makes parents relax. It doesn't mean you can't do anything. It just means that if your kid becomes schizophrenic, you don't have to beat yourself up about it because it isn't what you did. So that's kind of the bottom line of why genetics was important, because if you assume everything's environmental, you make some huge mistakes. But more technically, if genetics accounts for about half of the differences between people in psychological traits, which is generally true. I mean, we've gone from not accepting genetic influence on any trait to now we say, show me any trait, logically trait that's reliably measured that does not show significant genetic influence. Everything, this is called the first law of behavioral genetics, everything, all psychological and actually physical, physiological, and biological traits, everything is highly heritable. But on average, it accounts for 50% of the differences. So that means it does not account for 50%. That other 50% is what we call environment. But it's a very narrow definition of genetics. We're only talking about inherited DNA differences. So there's many DNA phenomena like skin cancer that involves mutations in DNA in your skin when exposed to sun, but it's not inherited. So that would be counted as environment. Any biological insults, illnesses, everything that isn't due to inherited DNA differences is called environment. So genetics is defined very narrowly, and the environment defined very broadly, includes everything that's not genetic. So what is this environment? And as I say, social scientists, psychologists especially, have always assumed it's nurture. It's due to the family environment. That's not unreasonable. Everyone from Freud onwards thought it was true. But no, it's not true. What's shared in families, what makes a difference in families is genetics. The environment's important, but it's not due to growing up in a family with someone, which is what we call shared environment. You share an environment with your parents, and that could contribute to your similarity between you and your parents. But that's not the answer. And my book goes into it in detail, and this is something well documented over 30 years. It isn't just some crazy theory. So almost everyone accepts that the way the environment works is not the way we thought it worked. It is not due to nurture, shared family environment. So what is it due to? Well, we have this residual term with a residual word, non-shared environment. It means whatever it is, it's not shared by family members. And then you start thinking about it, as we've done for 30 years, trying to identify what these non-shared environmental factors are. And there's lots of ways to do it, like identical twins who grow up in the same family. They don't differ genetically. They only differ because of the environment. So what's making them different? And the answer after 30 years of research is we don't know. And I've come to conclude, you could study things like differential treatment of parents. Parents don't treat the kids the same. So maybe differences in how parents treat their kids could be a factor. It's not. They treat their kids differently, but when you put it in genetically sensitive designs, as we've done, you find that they treat the kids differently. It didn't cause the difference in the kids. The parents are responding to genetic differences in the kids. So one of the messages here is you can't assume that correlations are causal. Forever you see in the newspapers, media, parents do this and the kids are like that. Yeah, there's a correlation between parents and offspring, but I think most people know this axiom called correlation does not imply causation. And most of the time, correlations between parents and offspring are not due to the parents causing outcomes in the kids. It's actually due to the parents responding to differences in the kids. That's what we call the nature of nurture. But getting back to non-shared environment, after 30 years of research, we just can't find these non-shared environmental factors. And so I've come to conclude that they're idiosyncratic and non-systematic, basically chance. Things happen. And if you ask people about their lives, I don't know about your life, but I can look at several turning points in my life that were totally due to chance, and they made a big difference. They weren't systematic. I avoided getting killed in an airplane accident, and when we crashed. And I avoided the draft in the first year of the draft for the Vietnam War. It was my birth date, and my number came up 323, which meant I would never get drafted because 321 out of 365 would be drafted first. But then also going to the University of Texas, I went there for graduate school because they paid me to go there. I was an inner city Chicago kid, and so I thought that was a pretty good scam. You know, they pay you to go to school. But then it turns out they had a course in behavioral genetics. And it completely turned me on. I didn't even know that course existed. So I find in talking to many people looking back on their lives, first, people have a story about it. You can always make up a story about how it is you made all these great decisions and you ended up where you are. It was, under your control. But then when you get past that nonsense, I think, people say, God, there was a lot of luck here. I mean, if this had happened, I'd be screwed. Because of these events, things worked out well for me. There's a big role for chance. And when you turn to parents, that's a hard thing to accept because parents put so much energy into thinking they can control their kids' outcomes. But it's a very important message that most of the differences in personality, psychopathology, and school achievement are due to genetics. Mm-hmm. The environment, though, is largely non-shared, which I think means idiosyncratic, stochastic, in a word, chance. So that means parents can't control chance. It doesn't mean they can't make a difference, but they need to recognize they have much less control than they think. And I think it's far better to recognize genetic differences between children and to go with the genetic flow rather than imposing your view, a priori view of what your child ought to become, whether it's an Olympic athlete or musician or whatever. I mean, it doesn't work. And in the end, I think it's very counterproductive because your lifelong relationship with a child is a relationship. And if you are only doing things because you're trying to change the child, to make them be what you want them to be, it doesn't make for a good relationship. Like with your partner, if you only do nice things for your partner because you want to make them a better person, it's not going to work very well. You do good things for them because you love them and you want life to be nice for them, not because you want to change them. So I think this has enormous potential for transforming the way we think about parenting, but also about education and many other issues as well. So to summarize then, I'm saying that genetics has shown the environment's important, but the environment works very differently from the way we thought it worked. It's this non-shared environment, which I believe after 30 years of research, we kind of have to say is idiosyncratic, unsystematic, stochastic, chance, random sorts of things. Shit happens.
I think you're right also in the book that the influence of these, single events, although it tends to be larger than that of the shared environment, it tends to, wane with time. One sort of, there is this regression towards the mean, so to say, as your life trajectory unfolds, meaning that one will be influenced sometimes deeply by these idiosyncratic events, but then as time unfolds, you will sort of go back to a mean trajectory, which is heavily influenced by your genetics, and also maybe on a connected point, at least for some traits, the research has indicated that the influence of the genes increases throughout life.
Yes, I think that's one of the interesting findings. In psychology, a lot of the findings are boring in the sense everybody knew that. I mean, it's important to document things that everybody thought they knew because sometimes they're wrong. But it's far more interesting to come up with things that nobody anticipated. And one of those is the one you just pointed out. If you ask people, if they understand what you mean by heritability, genetic influences on individual differences, they understand that. And you say, as you go through life, will heritability go up or go down? And people will say it goes down. Why? Because your genes are constant from birth and the environment is changing all the time. Shakespeare's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Things happen, environmental things. So it's very reasonable to think heritability goes down. So finding that heritability goes up, as it does very clearly, we know for sure it does for general learning ability, intelligence, what we call general cognitive ability, G. In infancy, heritability of can I call it intelligence? The word intelligence is like a red flag to people, but it is the word that's commonly used to refer to general problem solving, abstract reasoning. It's not far removed from what the man on the street would mean if they said, wow, that guy's very intelligent. So if I can just use the word intelligent and not upset listeners who hate that word, the heritability of intelligence is about 20% in early childhood, about 40% in middle childhood to adolescence, and about 60% in adulthood, and some people say 80% later in life if you control for dementia. So that is huge. That's from 20% to 80%. That's of the variance, of the differences. And, these are off the scale of findings in the behavioral sciences. So to put that in perspective, in psychology, the biggest findings explain maybe 5% of the differences. We call it variance as a statistic that measures variability, differences between people. Our research shows that we can predict school performance. We can explain about 15% of the differences between children only knowing their DNA, knowing nothing else about them. People say, well, that's 15%. That's a long way from 100%. Well, we'll only ever get to heritability, which is 60% for school achievement. But 15% is a long way from 60%. But we've only been doing this for a few years. But what I like to point out is that 15% is a lot of variance in the behavioral sciences. Like in England, we measure the quality of schools. We have examiners that go to schools. They rate these schools as over 2 days. They interview everybody. It's the best sort of rating of the quality of a school you can find. So I say, how much of the variance in school performance can be explained by the quality of the school? And the answer is 4%, as opposed to 15%. Yet parents spend I don't think it's true in Germany, but in England, parents spend hundreds of thousands of euros to get their kids into the right school based on these quality ratings. And maybe that's fine, and maybe they do it for reasons like better resources, better art, better sports. But if they're doing it because they think it'll improve educational performance, it doesn't really. Genetics accounts for maybe 4 times as much of the differences between kids. So 15% is a lot, and in general, behavioral genetic results are the most powerful findings around. By a long shot, nothing gets near to approaching the power of genetics in influencing how people turn out.
I just wanted to say maybe we should clarify, because you were mentioning this figure of 15% of variability in school achievement that is explained by genes. This is really genes that have been identified specifically, right? But it doesn't account for the whole 60% of the variance, which is explained by genes. Some of these genes are known, some of them are not identified. But it's much more than 15% of the variance, which is explained in general by inherited DNA differences.
Yes. So the thing is that twin adoption studies point to everything being at least 50% heritable. School achievements may be more heritable than other things, but about 60% heritable. So that's been known for a long time.
Yeah.
But to everyone's surprise, when we started looking for genes for behavior, the star was educational achievement, school performance, which is kind of amusing in a way, because education has been one of the last areas to accept the influence of genetics.
Yeah.
And yet, here's the area where we're able to predict from DNA better than anything else. We can predict weight and height better. But in psychology, for behavioral traits, we can predict educational achievement with DNA better than any other trait. And as you said, the discovery was that there are many genes of small effect. So the revolution came from realizing that we're going to have to put a lot of those thousands of those little differences together. And that's what we call a polygenic score, a multiple gene score. So polygenic scores are the key to why we're able to predict behavior from DNA, because single genes don't do it. I do need to mention, though, we mentioned phenylketonuria before in single gene disorders. There are 10,000 of these single gene disorders. They're necessary and sufficient. So Huntington's disease on chromosome 4, if you have that gene, you will die from Huntington's. which is a neurological degeneration sort of thing.
Mm.
It doesn't matter what your environment is. It's necessary and sufficient. So that's what people learn about genetics from Mendel onwards. They're thinking of single genes and deterministic, hardwired effects. They exist. These single gene disorders are like that. But the thing is, for common disorders like heart disease or alcoholism, as well as quantitative traits like educational achievement, there aren't any major gene effects like that. The genetic influence is substantial, but it involves thousands and thousands of tiny DNA differences. But we can put them together in a polygenic score. But the main difference is everything's probabilistic then. It's not deterministic. And this is a really important point because people think of, once you say genetics, people are thinking, it's all determined, can't do anything about it. But that's not true. This is probabilistic. And people don't get probability. They don't get risk, but life is probabilistic. There's very few things you can tell someone that are absolutely true. You can smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and you don't necessarily die from lung cancer. And if you drive at above the drunk driving level, you don't necessarily get in a crash. It's all probabilistic. But in those cases, we say the probabilities are strong enough that we say you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't smoke and you shouldn't drive drunk. But the probabilities we're talking about here are even stronger when we talk about predicting educational performance from DNA itself. So we're not predicting all the heritability, but we're still making a pretty strong prediction as things go. Like if you take kids' DNA scores, these polygenic scores, they'll be normally distributed, a bell-shaped curve. You take the top 10%, bottom 10% of that polygenic distribution. In the UK, kids in the top 10%, 75% go to university. In the bottom 10%, 25% go to university. So at the extremes, this is making, this is real. And it's going to only get stronger as we get better and better at this sort of research. So that was a long-winded answer to your question, but I hope that was useful.
No, it's quite okay because I think it's nice to insist on the specific topic of education. It's really, as you said, it's one of the fields in which, talking about genetic influences is least welcome, it seems to me. And I don't know how it is in other countries, but in France, there is a very important tradition of sociological research in education. And there are these very famous works that talk about how school sort of drives the social reproduction of the elites and of the social classes in general. And the mechanism is always, the shared environment. It's taken for granted that it's the way children are raised and the home environment and how their parents interact with them that drive differences in educational attainment. And still to this day, very recently there was a several thousand-page book in France by many sociologists that was still interested in exactly these themes and, very optimistically trying to explain all the differences in educational achievement in terms of shared environment, it seems to me.
Yeah. I'm interested in why France seems to be more that way than any other European country I know about. And I think it has to do with the intellectual traditions in France. Yeah. But I do find it surprising. France is off the scale on what we call the blank slate approach.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of things wrong with it. If you assume it's all environmental, well, then if the kids don't turn out right, whose fault is it? You blame the schools, you blame the parents, you blame the kids. They're not trying hard enough. But, if you don't recognize genetics, you don't recognize the fact that some kids just find it a lot more difficult to learn to read, to comprehend material, for example. And if you think it's only because the school didn't do good enough or the parents didn't try hard enough or the kid did, it really is kind of a blaming sort of approach because it's environmental, you know?
But since, maybe we shouldn't digress too much in that direction, but since it tends to be, I don't think the sociologists who use this lens would tend to blame individual participants like the parents or the children. I think they would sort of blame, these overarching structures that define society and have an interest in reproducing inequality, these sort of...
I know you don't want to go off too much on that. One more thing to say about it. Does anyone think if you put all kids, you give them exactly the same education, they really think there won't be any differences in how well the kids do? I mean, can anyone think that? Any teacher who has a few dozen kids in
Yeah,
class, they know that's not true. They're
of
giving the
course.
kids the same instruction, but some of
Mm.
them, are just, you think of math, they're just way off on the math, and the others are struggling with basic arithmetic.
Yeah, but probably the response from these social scientists would be that this is due to parental care and the home environment, that these children are raised in such a way and they are exposed to books and like cultural material and whatnot. They do make the case that it's purely environmentally driven, and I don't know if they, are aware of the distinction between shared and non-shared environment, but certainly they have, it seems to me, no interest in the genetic factors. And as you were saying, I think it's strongest, I mean, so to say, in the French context. But this leads me to ask you, how strong is it still in the, maybe in the English speaking world, of course? Well, we mentioned the blank slate now, so there was this book by Steven Pinker, and many people have complained that in the social sciences, there is this tendency to explain everything in terms of the environment. People who do evolutionary psychology tend to complain about that. And I was wondering, in your experience, what is really the state of affairs in the social sciences? How open are researchers to genetic explanations, so to say?
Yeah. Well, if you take a long view on it, when I started in psychology in the 1970s, psychology was totally environmentalistic. It was very dangerous even to say, well, perhaps schizophrenia might show some genetic influence. We can't just assume it's all environmental. That was even dangerous. It was dangerous to even suggest there could be genetic influence. But then after 40 years of research, empirically oriented scientists can't ignore this mountain of evidence. It isn't just one method. Increasingly now, we're measuring genetic influence with DNA itself. You might argue with twin studies, adoption studies, people who don't like genetics, they just dismiss those. They say, oh, those are just indirect sort of experiments. How do you argue with DNA? I say, give me one cell and I'll measure your DNA and I'll make predictions about you and alcoholism and dementia and things like that. You just can't argue with it anymore. I don't find any hostility to genetics anymore. There was hostility in decades ago when they thought you must be a Nazi if you're studying genetic influence or something. People accept it now. And I think as parents have children, they come to accept these differences. It's said that parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. With the first child, you can explain anything away environmentally. But when you have more than one child and you see how different they are from early in life, because they're 50% similar, but they're 50% different genetically, it really does make parents say, wait, I didn't do that. I mean, these kids came genetically different, So I think the public is accepting of it, and psychology has become very accepting of it. I was just last week given the Lifetime Achievement Award from the British Psychological Society. I've been given Lifetime Achievement Awards from many other societies, but this one means a lot because the British Psychological Society has been very anti-genetic over the years. And so this is a real recognition of the importance of genetics. So, I think that's an important marker. But there's other markers too. The number of highly cited papers in behavioral genetics is way off the scale for psychology. The funding, way off the scale. So these are all indices of the importance of genetics. And I'm convinced things are going this way. However, there's this thing that started in the last couple years with critical theory, and I blame it a lot on the French.
Yes, I think it's fair.
Where I think fundamentally, I'm trying to get my head around it, but fundamentally, it's motivated by the rejection of anything biological or genetic. Do you know what I mean? Like when you think of sex,
Right.
I mean, these are politically explosive topics to say, actually, men and women are different biologically. I mean, from a genetics point of view, it seems crazy to say that's not true. I mean, because men have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, and women have two X chromosomes. You can't deny that there's that biological difference. So I know these are sensitive issues, and I don't normally get into group differences like males and females or race differences. But I do think that this trend towards acceptance of genetics has run up against, I don't know if it's too derogatory to say, a far left sort of position that I think it's maybe not motivated by, but a strong underlying current is an anti-biology, anti-genetic perspective. Everything is due to oppression in society, and we got to blow up these structures and hope that it's all better in the aftermath of the explosion.
Right.
This has happened many times before and often failed. Sometimes, like the Soviet Union, it took a long time to fail. But I thought this is just so crazy that this nonsense has to come to an end. But given that they've tied into a lot of, it's like using anything that comes up like Black Lives Matter and hijack it for the good of this cause, for, blowing things up. So it troubles me a lot. But so far when I give talks, people aren't connecting what I'm talking about with these larger issues, or maybe people who come to listen to me aren't into this. In fact, I don't know how many people are. I mean, I don't think the man on the street, when I tell them in academia, it's difficult to say men and women are biologically different. They say, are you kidding me? I mean, that's nonsense, But it really is true. You would have to be careful in academia, even in the UK, which I think of as more open-minded about things. You got to be careful about saying men and women are biologically different. You have to hurry up and say, yeah, but gender is a different thing altogether. Gender's fluid. That's fine. I can wake up tomorrow and think I'm a woman, and that, I got to respect that. But I cannot. No one's going to make me say men and women are biologically indistinguishable. Because, that is just 1984 and thought police and all of that stuff. And it does trouble me. More fundamentally, it's anti-scientific. It's not just anti-biological, anti-genetic, but it's anti-scientific. And that troubles me a lot.
Yeah. We've had many guests on the podcast to discuss this, like Helen Pluckrose, Peter Boghossian. I don't know if you're familiar with their work, but they are on the front lines of, fighting this battle, I guess, against critical theory, as one can call it. And it is, this notion that all categories should be abolished because they are necessarily oppressive seems to be one of the central drives behind it. And indeed, biological categories being perceived as firmly established and definable, they are often targeted by these activists who also happen to be scholars for many of them. Indeed, in academia, they have a stronghold.
Well, when I was in psychology in the early 1970s, there was a movement called Science for the People. It's actually trying to be rejuvenated now. But it was an elite group of white, middle-aged Harvard professors deciding what is for the people. And they decided genetics is not for the people. Genetics is bad. Environment is good.
Right.
And that fizzled out eventually, but it was kind of the aftermath of the 60s and all of that.
Was Stephen Jay Gould part of this?
That's right. And Leon Kamen, they were kind of like the triad behind this. But it just is amazing to think that elite Harvard middle-aged white professors decide what is for the people. And I do think it's like that. There are some, it's a relatively small number of fanatics, I think. And other people kind of just maybe go along with it or whatever. But it's troubling that it's not just the far left. It's most of the left is unwilling to stand up and say, this is nonsense. You don't just burn buildings down because you want to build a better society, So I hope it comes to an end. I see a backlash mounting, don't you? I hope that's true.
It's been, there's been increasing resistance for a few years now, and people have, at least some of the more serious people who have opposed these trends have really done the work of looking at the intellectual foundations of this sort of anti-scientific movements, as you were saying. Again, Helen Pluckrose, Peter Boghossian, and before them there was Alan Sokal and others that did a lot of work to understand where this is coming from. And as I keep telling people, you might oppose the politics of these radical movements, but it's important to understand that there is really a philosophy of knowledge. There is something very deep and academic at the heart of it. It's not just these radical militants. Of course, they are there, but they have a deep relationship with what has been developing on campus in these humanities departments and the critical theory ones in particular. And so I think it's important to really understand the intellectual dimension of these movements.
Yes, I think we should all respect each other and realize we need civilized discussion. But it isn't religion. It isn't like you must believe these things. anything can be questioned. But what I really resent is the unwillingness to even discuss these things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's many similarities between these ideologies, these far left, for lack of a better word, critical theory ideologies and religion, insofar, or in as much as they really forbid one to consider some just explanatory hypothesis, whatever problem you're thinking about. If you're thinking about, in our case, difference in personalities and in life outcomes, they will not stand for some explanations being considered, and they have no interest in any research showing that these explanations have empirical value, clearly, it seems to me. We just discussed how these findings of behavioral genetics tend to go against some popular narratives on the left, which explain inequalities and individual differences in terms of environmental influences exclusively. And I think one could say also that the findings of behavioral genetics go against some popular narratives on the right, which tend to say that people can achieve essentially any results if they just work hard enough. That the idea that, if you give yourself the means to obtain a given outcome, a given result, you will just be able to do so. And I think fewer people have discussed this clash, or this sort of friction between the findings of genetics and these narratives on the right. I mean, I think Jordan Peterson, one can say, has discussed them when he says that some people, you have to accept that they will probably not go to higher education, and it should be thought about, what kind of professional path they can take.
Yeah, I think it's a very important issue. I mean, first, I'd say there's no necessary relationship between the scientific data and policy. You could have the heritability of intelligence. You could have a right-wing point of view or a left-wing point of view on it. The left-wing view in education is known as the Finnish model, where you say what's important is to put resources into the lower end of the distribution, the kids who are going to have trouble reaching minimal levels of literacy and numeracy. You need to participate in an increasingly technological society. So that's a very reasonable view based, depends on your values. But the right-wing point of view could be educate the best, forget the rest. Let's just give the best people the very best resources. Well, there's reasons to think that isn't necessary, because Galton, who founded behavioral genetics, Darwin's cousin, in the late 1800s, said ability will out. That is, if you'd seen musically gifted kids, you almost would have trouble stopping them from becoming musically skillful, because it doesn't mean the best teachers in the world. It means they can sing, they can hang out with friends, they can play Spotify, they can make their environment fit their genetic propensities. So I think it is important to recognize that policy and scientific evidence are two different things, and often necessarily follow from evidence. But then, the point you're making is a good one, that people think genetics is allied with the right and environment is allied with the left. That's almost just historical happenstance. And as you point out, I think a lot of people on the right think all it takes is hard work and you'll get there. They think they're self-made. They're doing well, and they merit all the goodies they get from society because they've done so well, because they've worked so hard. But, I think that's a stereotype that isn't really true. I mean, people I know who are like that have done very well. They're actually kind of humble about the role of chance in their life. The fact that genetics is chance, really. I mean, the fact that we weren't born in a civil war in Africa or something, that's chance, really. I mean, it's all the same human DNA. So there's a big role for chance there. And I think genetics actually should end up making people be more tolerant. Like, I have a high genetic propensity towards obesity. And people say, oh, well, then you're just going to give up and say you're going to be fat, nothing you can do about it. To the contrary, I find it's motivating to me to know that I've got a real battle here. I mean, skinny people like you don't have to worry about it. But, it's a real constant battle for me. And it doesn't mean I can't do anything about it. It means I have to work harder because I can gain weight easier and it's harder to take it off. So I think, I don't know if it's true in France, but in the UK, there's this fat shaming that goes on. People are actually thinking about charging people for hospital costs due to obesity-related
Right.
disorders like diabetes, for example, heart disease, and now COVID-19. It's all obesity is bad for you. But skinny people think, yeah, well, just get a grip, have some self-control. Don't eat so much. Well, that's very easy to say if you don't have a genetic capacity to put on weight. And it's true, if I don't eat, I'll lose weight. But it isn't as simple as that, as we know from diets. I mean, you can lose the weight, the yo-yo phenomenon, you lose weight, you put it back on. As you said very much earlier, you go back to kind of a genetic trajectory, really. So
Right.
I do think tolerance is needed here to recognize that people are genetically different, and we need to respect those differences and, well, just be more tolerant in general, I think. I hope that's a genetic message, but I kind of hope that's a message in general. What we need is a great deal more kindness and tolerance and, willing to, someone who disagrees with you isn't necessarily an idiot. I mean, they probably, as you were saying, even with the critical theorists, who I don't have much patience for, nonetheless,
Right.
they're not just crazy. That you got to respect
Yeah.
other people and be willing to tolerate differences in opinion. I just insist, though, that we have to be able to discuss stuff. No one's going to tell me this is
Yes.
catechism and you must say this, or otherwise
Yeah.
you're going to be deplatformed.
Yeah, that's where one should draw the line, absolutely. I have another question, which is probably again related to how some people can be troubled by the findings of behavioral genetics, particularly people who just tend to dislike the idea that genes, play an important part in our lives. Many of them tend to bring up epigenetics, probably very vaguely in many cases. I don't know if they have much of an idea what they are talking about, but they tend to bring it up to imply that genes, don't play such a big role after all. What do you make of
A
this?
very good topic. That's frequently one of the two first questions I get in a public audience. What about epigenetics?
Okay.
It's sort of the current fad. And
Mm-hmm.
the bottom line is, I talk about this in 2019, I had a paperback edition come out, and what I added to it was a chapter called Afterward, where I talk about reactions that have come up to the book and my response to them. And one of them is epigenetics. And the bottom line is that you don't inherit epigenetic differences. So you inherit DNA sequence differences. Now, you have 3 billion base pairs of DNA. It's the same DNA in all the cells of your body, but different DNA is turned on and off in parts of your body. The genes in your liver that are expressed, we call it, are different from the genes expressed in the brain. So that's due to RNA, which transcribes and translates DNA code. This is a very condensed version of this, but RNA is responsive to the environment. Whereas genetics, the inherited DNA sequence, that gives you continuity across the species, except for evolution, which means people don't reproduce if they're not fit for the environment in which they live. But in general, DNA is a constant, whereas RNA is responsive to the environment. So that's very important. Gene expression is very important. But if I show you that these inherited DNA differences are correlated with differences in behavior, like schizophrenia, it means it was expressed, because otherwise it couldn't have a difference. But because there are so many genes of such small effect, it's going to be a long time till people are able to trace gene to brain to behavior pathways. And if you're a molecular biologist, that's a drag, because that's what you want to do. Whereas for me, I want to predict. And I can predict from inherited DNA sequence without knowing anything about gene expression, transcription, or metabolomics or proteomics or the brain or anything. I can predict behavior from inherited DNA differences. So you don't inherit epigenetic differences. And gene expression is important, but what we're doing is predicting behavior from inherited DNA differences. So epigenetics is not necessary for us to understand.
Mm-hmm. So would it be correct to say that in your research, in behavioral genetics research, epigenetics is one of the factors that enters the environment domain?
Exactly right. That's what I think is exciting. Epigenetics has been way overplayed. But what I think it could be exciting for is as a biological index of the environment.
Okay. I think I've actually reached the end of my questions. Do you think I failed to ask you about anything important?
Well, there are so many other issues. One big one is the one you
Right.
just alluded to briefly, was that, say, with educational achievement, we're explaining 15% of the variability with DNA, but it's 60% heritable. And that's the big issue in all of the life sciences. It's called missing heritability. We're not explaining all of the heritability of traits given our current approaches. And so that's a very hot topic. I think it will be maybe not resolved, but helped by whole genome sequencing. I mentioned that our SNP chips get at millions of DNA differences at a single base pair. But genome sequencing just sequences all 3 billion base pairs of DNA. That's all there is in terms of genetics. So that is likely to help us reduce this missing heritability gap. The other thing is we've only been doing this for a decade, and in psychology only for a few years, and we've already explained more variance in traits than we can explain from other measured traits. So we're doing pretty well, and the only way is up. We can only explain more and more. And so we're trying to do that with very much larger studies, millions of people, to try to pick up very small effects. So I think that's the big question in the future. How much of the missing heritability gap will we be able to close with whole genome sequencing and larger studies? And otherwise, there's so many other things to talk about, but I think we've touched on most of the big ones.
Okay. Then that's nice, and I'm very happy to have had this conversation. It was a very interesting book, very interesting interview.
Well, thanks very much. Nice talking to you. Good luck with your podcast.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @acadfreedom and also on Facebook.